The gym buzzed with restless energy, a cauldron of anticipation under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. Shouts ricocheted off cinder-block walls, mingling with the rhythmic slap of bare feet on padded mats. Families perched on metal bleachers, their murmurs weaving through the clatter of folding chairs. Competitors in crisp white karate uniforms stretched, shadowboxed, or paced, their faces taut with focus. Coaches barked last-minute advice, while judges shuffled scorecards, their pens scratching like distant thunder. It was the opening round of the Coastal States Karate Championship in a small Virginia town, just another humid Saturday morning. Or so it seemed. No one paid much attention to the man who slipped in late. He moved with a quiet purpose, his steps measured, his broad shoulders set like a sentinel's. Dressed in a faded gray t-shirt tucked into loose white GI pants, he wore no belt, no patches, no trace of a dojo's emblem. His dark hair was cropped close, military style, and his weathered boots left faint scuffs on the polished floor. At the registration table, he handed over a single form and an ID, his calloused hands steady. Name: Caleb Morrow. Division: Adult Men's Elite. The volunteer barely glanced up, pointing him toward the warm-up area. Caleb didn't go. Instead, he found a corner near a cracked window, sat on a wooden bench, and folded his hands. His posture was rigid, not with tension, but with the stillness of someone who'd stood watch in worse places than this. In the stands, a woman in her 60s, sipping iced tea from a plastic cup, nudged her husband. She squinted at Caleb, her brow furrowing. "I've seen him before," she murmured, her voice low. Last summer, on a trip to Arlington National Cemetery, she'd watched a soldier in a pristine dress uniform perform the changing of the guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier. His movements had been flawless, each step a study in precision, untouched by the sweltering heat or the crowd's murmurs. She hadn't forgotten the weight of his presence, the way his eyes never wavered. That soldier, she was certain, was Caleb Morrow. The tournament churned forward, names blared over a crackling loudspeaker, scores flashed on a digital board. Fighters clashed, some with ferocity, others with hesitation. Cheers erupted, punctuated by groans or bursts of laughter. Through it all, Caleb sat apart, unmoving. He didn't stretch, didn't practice forms, didn't even shift in his seat. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, tracked the matches with a quiet intensity, like a hawk studying a field. To the crowd, he was an oddity, a man in his late 30s, too old for a beginner, too plain for a master. A group of teenagers snickered, gesturing at his bare waist. "No belt?" "Probably a white pretending to be tough," one muttered. A coach nearby shook his head, assuming Caleb was a last-minute entry, someone chasing a fleeting dream. But the woman in the stands, Clara, saw something else. She leaned toward her husband again. "That's no pretender," she whispered. "That's a tomb guard. They don't move unless it matters." Her husband raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He'd learned to trust her instincts. When Caleb's name finally echoed through the gym, Caleb Morrow versus Javier Ruiz, Men's Elite Division, heads turned. He rose smoothly, his boots silent now, and approached the mat. His bow was minimal, just a dip of his head, but it carried weight, like a salute. Javier, his opponent, was a wiry man in his early 30s, a local favorite with a black belt knotted tightly around his waist. He bounced on his toes, his GI snapping with each movement, a grin tugging at his lips as he sized up Caleb's plain attire. "Easy round," Javier muttered to a teammate, cracking his knuckles. The judge raised a hand, signaling the start. Javier moved first, darting in with a quick snap kick aimed at Caleb's midsection. Caleb didn't flinch. He shifted his weight, just enough, letting the kick whistle past by inches. Javier pressed forward, throwing a flurry of jabs, each one sharp and practiced. Caleb angled his body, his movements spare, almost invisible. Each punch missed, not by much, but enough. The crowd stirred, murmurs rippling through the bleachers. Javier's grin faded. He tried a spinning back kick, fast and high, but Caleb sidestepped, his feet gliding across the mat like water over stone. When Javier overreached, his balance faltering, Caleb didn't strike. He simply stepped aside, letting Javier stumble out of bounds. The judge's hand shot up. Point awarded. Match over. Caleb bowed again, barely a nod, and returned to his bench. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Lucky dodge," one spectator scoffed. "He didn't even fight," another complained. But Clara, watching from the stands, shook her head. "That wasn't luck," she said softly. "That was control." The bracket moved on, and soon Caleb's next match was announced. Caleb Morrow versus Hiroshi Kato. The name alone hushed the room. Hiroshi, a lean, intense man of 29, was a legend in the circuit, a 4-time national champion who'd trained under masters in Osaka. His GI bore the gold-stitched crest of his dojo, and his black belt was frayed from years of relentless practice. As he stepped onto the mat, his eyes flicked to Caleb, then to the judges, a faint smirk curling his lip. "No belt?" he said, his voice carrying a trace of an accent. "You are soldier, yes? I honor your service. But this is not your place." Caleb didn't respond. He bowed, his gaze steady, and took his stance. The judge's hand dropped. Hiroshi exploded into motion, a blur of precision. A front kick, a reverse punch, a spinning heel kick, each move a masterpiece of technique. But Caleb wasn't there. He shifted, leaned, stepped, always just out of reach. His movements were economical, deliberate, like a man who'd memorized the geometry of combat. Hiroshi's strikes cut through empty air, his GI snapping loudly in the silence. The crowd held its breath. Hiroshi's smirk vanished, replaced by a tight frown. He feinted high, then swept low, aiming to unbalance Caleb. But Caleb stepped over the sweep, his body flowing like a shadow, untouched. 3 exchanges in, Hiroshi's breathing grew sharp. He lunged again, a double jab followed by a roundhouse kick. Caleb tilted his head, shifted his hips, and let the attacks pass. No counter, no aggression, just presence. A veteran coach in the front row leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "That's not dodging," he muttered. "That's mastery." Hiroshi's frustration mounted. He barked something in Japanese, his stance widening. He faked a punch, then launched a flying sidekick, pouring every ounce of his skill into it. The crowd gasped, expecting impact. But Caleb dipped, just enough, and Hiroshi's kick missed by a hair. He landed hard, his balance wavering. For the first time, Caleb moved toward him. 2 steps, then a pause. He didn't strike. His hand stayed low, his eyes calm, but the message was unmistakable. "I see you. I'm here." The gym was silent now, the air thick with awe. Hiroshi reset, his chest heaving, sweat beading on his forehead. He glanced at the judges, then back at Caleb, and something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or fear. Caleb wasn't fighting to win. He was waiting. For what, no one could say. But the weight of that waiting hung over the mat like a storm ready to break. Hiroshi Kato's breaths came in sharp bursts, his polished technique fraying at the edges. The Coastal States Karate Championship had reached its peak, the gym's air heavy with the scent of sweat and anticipation. The crowd, once buzzing with chatter, now sat hushed, their eyes locked on the mat where Caleb Morrow stood, unmoved, his gray t-shirt barely creased. Hiroshi, the reigning champion, circled like a predator, his black belt taut against his GI, but his movements betrayed a flicker of doubt. He wasn't just fighting Caleb, he was fighting the unsettling calm that radiated from him, a stillness that seemed to swallow every strike. Hiroshi lunged again, his frustration boiling over. A spinning elbow sliced through the air, aimed to jolt Caleb off his axis. Caleb didn't block or retreat. He pivoted, his shoulder brushing past Hiroshi's arm with the precision of a metronome. In that fleeting moment, Caleb's hand lifted, not to strike, but to graze Hiroshi's side with a single, deliberate tap. It was light, almost gentle, but it landed like a thunderclap in Hiroshi's mind. "You were open," it said. "I could have ended this." Hiroshi recoiled, his eyes widening, not from pain but from the weight of that unspoken truth. The crowd stirred, a low murmur rippling through the bleachers. Clara, the woman in the stands who'd recognized Caleb from Arlington, gripped her husband's arm. "He's not fighting," she whispered. "He's teaching." Hiroshi's composure cracked. He growled, his stance dropping lower, and charged with a judo-inspired takedown, aiming to drag Caleb to the mat, where raw strength might prevail. It was a desperate move, born of a champion's pride stung by futility. But Caleb didn't resist. He stepped into the charge, his body flowing like water around a stone. With a subtle twist of his hips, he redirected Hiroshi's momentum. It wasn't a throw, not a sweep, just a shift, elemental and inevitable. Hiroshi's feet tangled, his balance collapsed, and he crashed face-first onto the mat with a dull thud that echoed in the silent gym. The room froze. No one breathed. Hiroshi lay still for a heartbeat, his hands pressing against the mat, his chest heaving. Slowly he pushed himself up, his face a mask of shock and something deeper. Humility? The judge hesitated, then raised a hand, signaling the match's end. Caleb stood where he'd been all along, his hands at his sides, his expression unchanged. He hadn't thrown a punch, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even broken a sweat. Hiroshi rose, his gaze locked on Caleb, searching for answers. "How?" he asked, his voice raw, stripped of its earlier bravado. Caleb offered a hand. Hiroshi stared at it, then took it, his grip firm but reverent. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than applause. As the two men left the mat, the gym came back to life. Voices hushed and tentative, as if afraid to break the spell. Caleb returned to his bench, his movements as deliberate as ever, and sat, hands folded, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the banners and scoreboards. A tournament official approached, a clipboard clutched in his nervous hands. "That was something else," he said, his voice unsteady. "You're through to the finals, Mr. Morrow. Maybe even the title. We'd love to get a statement, maybe a photo for the local paper." Caleb shook his head, a single quiet motion. "That's not why I'm here." The official blinked, caught off guard. "Then, why are you here?" Caleb's gaze drifted across the gym, past the flickering fluorescent lights, past the families packing up their chairs. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, like a man reciting a vow. To keep a promise. The words hung in the air, simple but heavy, and the official stepped back, unsure how to respond. In the stands, Clara watched, her iced tea forgotten. She'd seen Caleb at Arlington, standing sentinel in the blistering heat, his rifle steady, his eyes unyielding. She'd felt the weight of his duty then, and she felt it now. This wasn't about trophies or headlines. This was about something older. Something carved into the bones of men who'd stood watch when others turned away. The tournament wound down, the crowd thinning as the final matches concluded. Trophies gleamed under the lights, handed out to beaming winners. Caleb didn't stay for the ceremony. He remained on his bench, a solitary figure against the chaos of departure. The official returned, holding a small silver trophy and a medal, his tone softer now, almost deferential. "You won, Mr. Morrow, by forfeit. Cato withdrew after your match, said he'd met his match." He set the awards beside Caleb, who didn't touch them. "We'd still like a photo. It's tradition." Caleb's eyes flicked to the man, calm but resolute. "I didn't come for tradition." The official hesitated, then pressed, his curiosity outweighing his caution. "Why did you fight then?" Caleb's fingers tightened slightly, a faint ripple of tension, as if gripping a memory. A folded flag, a rifle stock, a friend's hand. "There was a kid I served with," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Young, tough, always talking about martial arts. Wanted to open a school in Montana when he got out. Taught me forms in the sand, late at night, when the world was quiet." He paused, his jaw tightening. "He didn't make it back." The official's face softened. "I'm sorry." Caleb nodded once, then looked away. "I told him I'd fight one match if I got out. Not to win. Not to prove anything. Just to show what he believed. That strength isn't always loud. That quiet isn't weak." The official stood there, the trophy heavy in his hands, then turned and left without another word. The gym was nearly empty now. The Coastal States Karate Championship reduced to scattered chairs and the faint echo of footsteps on hardwood. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the mats where only hours ago the air had crackled with tension. Caleb Morrow remained on his bench, his gray t-shirt still tucked neatly into his white guy pants, his hands resting in his lap like a man waiting for a train that might never come. The silver trophy and medal sat untouched beside him, glinting faintly, relics of a victory he hadn't sought. Clara, the woman from the stands, lingered too. She stood near the bleachers, her husband gone to fetch their car, her eyes fixed on Caleb. She'd seen him at Arlington, a tomb guard standing sentinel through a summer storm, his uniform pristine despite the rain. That image had stayed with her, the unyielding stillness, the weight of duty in every measured step. Now, watching him sit alone in a small-town gym, she felt that same weight, heavier somehow, carried not in a rifle but in the quiet of his presence. She wanted to approach, to say something, but the space around him felt sacred, like a memorial you didn't disturb. Across the room, a young boy, maybe 10, hovered near the edge of the mat, clutching a water bottle. His GI was too big, the sleeve slipping over his knuckles, and his eyes darted between Caleb and the trophy. He'd been in the crowd earlier, tugging at his father's sleeve, asking why the man in the gray shirt hadn't fought like the others. Now, curiosity pulled him closer. He took a tentative step, then another, until he stood a few feet from Caleb. "Mister," he said, his voice small but clear, "why didn't you hit back?" Caleb's gaze shifted, meeting the boy's eyes. For a moment he seemed to see something else, sand and starlight, a young soldier laughing as he demonstrated a kata in the desert. Then he blinked, and the gym returned. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low, steady, "you don't need to hit to make a point." The boy frowned, confused, but nodded as if he sensed there was truth in it, even if he couldn't grasp it yet. He shuffled back to his father, who was packing a duffel bag, and whispered something that made the man glance at Caleb with new respect. Outside, the parking lot hummed with the last of the departing cars, their headlights slicing through the dusk. Clara finally moved, her sandal scuffing softly as she approached Caleb. She stopped a few feet away, her hands clasped. "I saw you," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "at Arlington last year. You were a tomb guard." Caleb's eyes flicked to her, but he didn't speak. She pressed on. "What you did today, it wasn't just about the match, was it?" Caleb's fingers twitched, the faintest sign of movement, as if tracing a memory. "No," he said simply. Clara waited, but he offered nothing more. She nodded, understanding that some answers didn't need words. "Whoever you fought for," she said, "they'd be proud." She turned to leave, then paused. "Thank you." Caleb dipped his head, a gesture so slight it might have been missed, but it carried the weight of a salute. Later that evening, Clara sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open. She typed out what she'd seen, her fingers moving slowly, deliberately, as if each word were a stone in a monument. She described the gym, the crowd, the way Caleb had moved like a shadow, untouchable, unyielding. She wrote about the champion, Hiroshi, and the moment he'd fallen, not from a strike, but from his own momentum, undone by a man who'd fought without fighting. She sent the story to a veterans newsletter she followed, not expecting much, just needing to share what she'd witnessed. It wasn't a story for headlines or viral posts. It was for those who'd understand, the ones who'd stood watch, who'd carried promises heavier than trophies. Weeks later, in a small dojo in Montana, a quiet seminar took place. No banners, no advertisements, just a handful of students and instructors gathered on a worn mat. At the front of the room, a folded American flag rested on a table, flanked by a single candle. The seminar was dedicated to a young soldier, a martial artist who dreamed of teaching others, whose name was spoken softly by those who'd known him. A custom belt lay beside the flag, its ends embroidered with two names, one the soldier's, the other Caleb's. No one knew who'd sent it, but they spoke of a man who'd come to the dojo just before the event. He'd stood at the back, silent, hands clasped behind him, his eyes fixed on the mat. When the session ended, he was gone, leaving no trace but the belt and a story that lingered like smoke. Clara's account spread quietly, shared among veterans groups and small martial arts communities. It didn't trend or spark debates. It simply existed, a testament to a man who'd fought one match, not for glory, but for a promise. Caleb Morrow didn't return to the tournament circuit. He didn't need to. He'd stood his ground, kept his word, and walked away, carrying the same quiet strength he'd always had. And for those who'd seen it, who'd felt the weight of his presence, that was enough. Because some battles aren't fought for crowds. Some are fought for the ones who can't fight anymore. The Virginia dusk settled over the gym's parking lot, painting the sky in streaks of amber and gray. Inside, the Coastal States Karate Championship had long since ended, the mats rolled up, the bleachers empty save for a few stray water bottles and crumpled programs. Caleb Morrow still sat on his bench, the silver trophy and medal beside him untouched, their shine dulled under the flickering fluorescence. His gray t-shirt clung to his shoulders, not from sweat, but from the humid air that lingered like a held breath. His hands, calloused and steady, rested in his lap, fingers interlaced as if anchoring him to a moment no one else could see. Outside, the last cars rumbled away, their taillights fading into the twilight. A janitor swept the floor near the gym's entrance, the broom's bristles hissing softly against the tiles. Caleb's eyes traced the room, not lingering on any one thing. The banners sagging on the walls, the scoreboard frozen with final tallies, the faint chalk marks where the mats had been. His stillness wasn't exhaustion or indecision. It was purpose, honed to a razor's edge, the kind of focus that could stand unmoved through a storm. He'd come to keep a promise, and though the match was over, the weight of it remained. A shadow moved near the gym's double doors. A man in his late 40s, wearing a faded polo shirt and carrying a duffel bag, hesitated before approaching. He was a coach from a nearby dojo, one who'd watched Caleb's match against Hiroshi Kato, with a growing sense of unease, not at Caleb's skill, but at what it revealed. He'd seen fighters with speed, with power, with raw ambition. But Caleb was different. He moved like a man who'd learned to measure every step, every breath, in places where mistakes cost more than points. The coach stopped a few feet away, clearing his throat. "You're Caleb Morrow, right?" he asked, his voice rough but respectful. Caleb's gaze flicked up, meeting the man's eyes. He nodded once, a gesture so minimal it barely registered. The coach shifted his weight, glancing at the trophy. "What you did out there. I've been in this game 30 years, and I've never seen anything like it. You didn't just win, you changed the whole room." He paused, expecting a response, but Caleb offered none. The coach pressed on. "You could go far, you know. Nationals, maybe even international circuits. Why walk away?" Caleb's fingers tightened slightly, a faint ripple of tension, as if brushing against a memory. "I didn't come to go far," he said, his voice low, steady, like a stone settling into a riverbed. "I came for one match." The coach frowned, confused, but something in Caleb's tone stopped him from pushing further. He nodded, slung his bag over his shoulder, and walked away, glancing back once as if hoping to catch a glimpse of what drove the man on the bench. In the quiet that followed, Caleb stood, his movement smooth, deliberate. He left the trophy and medal where they lay, their gleam irrelevant to him. He crossed the gym, his boots silent on the floor, and pushed through the double doors into the cooling night. The air outside was thick with the scent of pine and asphalt, the distant hum of crickets blending with the fading rumble of a passing truck. He didn't look back. His promise was kept, not to the crowd, not to the judges, but to a kid who'd once stood beside him in the desert, tracing katas under a sky heavy with stars. Weeks later, in a small Montana dojo, the story of Caleb's match took root. The seminar held in the young soldier's name drew a quiet crowd. Students in worn GIs, instructors with weathered hands, a few veterans who'd heard the tale through whispered channels. The folded flag on the table gleamed under soft light, the custom belt beside it bearing 2 names stitched in careful thread. No one spoke of Caleb directly, but his presence lingered in the room, in the way the students moved through their forms with a little more care, a little more purpose. Clara's story, shared in that veteran's newsletter, found its way to others. It passed from email chains to quiet conversations in VFW halls, from dojo bulletin boards to late-night talks among those who'd served. It wasn't a story of triumph or spectacle. It was a story of duty, of a man who'd fought not for himself, but for a memory, for a promise that outweighed any trophy. Caleb Morrow had stepped onto the mat, faced a champion, and walked away, leaving behind only the echo of his presence. And for those who understood, that echo was enough. Because some fights aren't about winning. Some are about standing, unflinching. For those who no longer can,